creo que llegamos a un momento donde Colombia salía de una época muy oscura de su historia y casi sin saberlo pudimos generar un espacio de conversación colectiva, que es lo que hizo que el festival tuviera tanto éxito.
Ese festival nos permitió entrar en conversación a los escritores, y eso es un fenómeno maravilloso.
No me imaginé que llegaríamos a los 20 años, debo confesarlo.
Me trajo la oportunidad de hablar de mí misma y de toda la comunidad LGBTIQ+, con otras palabras.
Si el Hey Festival no hubiera existido durante estos 20 años, muchos de nosotros seríamos muy distintos, nos ha enriquecido de la mejor manera posible.
Cuando nos desafinamos, no escuchamos bien las armonías y no podemos escuchar al otro, que es lo peor. Estos festivales son muy importantes porque podemos escuchar al otro.
It's the jewel in the crown of the Hay Festival in terms of its international presence.
And that's what we do. We tell stories and we try and bring the world together.
Para Sura, la cultura es un encuentro. Un encuentro de ideas diversas, identidades y expresiones. Un encuentro entre la historia y el presente que evoluciona. Entre la memoria y los nuevos imaginarios. Encuentros que nacen cuando las letras crean historias que te cautivan. Cuando un festival despierta tus ideas. Cuando la música convoca tus emociones. Y cuando el arte encuentra quien lo disfrute. Vive la cultura.
Dame un momento y te regalo un verso. Un beso que te transporte a mi universo, donde nademos cada lluvia y bailemos cada trueno. Respirar a todo pulmón en sincronización, en un mismo latido, al mismo tambor. Pum, pum, las penas del corazón. Invierte en tu pasión. ¿Cuál es el sueño que no te deja dormir? Sí, esto que te impulsa, esto que te mueve, también nos impulsa, inspira y conmueve.
Cuidemos nuestros ríos como si fueran nuestros hijos.
Recordando lo puro de la inocencia de un niño.
Volvamos a atrapar los peces con las manos.
Creciendo flores, melodías en los dedos. Atrapando de cada árbol la carne madura de guayaba, guanábana, caña y cacao. Y así oler a la más dulce fragancia, canela, candela, flamea.
Celebremos los paisajes y el aire que respiramos en la misma frecuencia.
Honrémoslos.
Eso también es nuestra herencia.
Viajes astrales a otros lugares y otros tiempos. Hombres colibríes al vuelo, cantando juntos goles sin distingo de colores. Escucha.
¿Cuáles son las historias que te llegan al alma?
Pum, pum, flash. La pelota en el charco, nuestro futuro campeón jugando.
El aroma del café que nunca falta en la mañana.
Y así no puedas ver la re, la sientes en la guitarra. Campesinas que confían en la tierra.
Y estudiantes que progresan con el libro.
Somos héroes y medallas de cotidianas batallas, haciendo la diferencia.
No importa dónde vayas.
Las estrellas y aldeas de luciérnagas nos revelan otra forma de ver la oscuridad.
Creyendo en las personas y nuestras ganas de avanzar.
Creer es crear.
Toma mi mano. ¿Lo sientes? Se agita.
Cuando empezamos a soñar.
Hello, hello. How's it going? I'll be speaking in Spanish for this introduction, but then I'll move on to English because our panelists are English speakers. So I hope you have your translation devices on you or that you speak English.
This is a most impressive group of people. I'm accompanied tonight by Nataliya Gumenyuk, who is a Ukrainian journalist who lives in Kyiv and I find her all over the world. She's very active, but lives at home in Ukraine. Susan Neiman, who's a moral philosopher, essayist, lives in Germany, is American, and whose most recent book is one that's come out here in Spanish called La izquierda no es woke, the left is not woke, which we may touch on at some point. Edward Chancellor is British. We just found out that we live pretty close to one another and have a whole raft of friends in common. But he is a financial journalist, and his most recent book, which has been long listed for a series of awards, is called The Price of Time. And Anne Applebaum, American and Polish now, has a sort of a dossier or what do you call it? A resume that is quite long, and but has been, an author, journalist, essayist, speaker on subjects relating to the fall of communism, the emergence of the post-Soviet order, and most recently a book called Autocracy, Inc. And we're all here together to sort of muse on the subject of democracy at a time when it feels somewhat under threat. And on that note, and so the Hay Festival has kindly given me a few questions as talking points, so we can veer from them. But that's sort of the idea, is to hear from this wonderful group of thinkers, how they're viewing this moment and the questions of our time related to that issue of democracy. And I thought to begin with a question that has been in my mind since a talk I was involved in yesterday. Some of you may have been there. I had a talk with Leonard Bernardo of the Open Society Foundations, and after we finished, there was a series of questions, and one man got up and asked, and he posed the question in this manner, and that's why I'm going to repeat it here. I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, isn't it worth a new world order sustained by conservatism, conservative world order of peace, instead of the liberal world of liberal wars that we have been living through? I mean, this was how he characterized it: a world of liberal imposed disorder. And shouldn't we be trading that in for obviously what Donald Trump and people like him and others see as its necessary replacement, a conservative system which might do away with some of our accustomed freedoms or notional freedoms? And I took issue with the question because it felt so loaded. And so I thanked him for his question, but I refused to answer it. But it seems to me, and I've had a few other questions like that in the past few days, it's curious, in different ways, questions along these lines, people trying to understand and maybe identify with the messages coming out of the Trump administration, things that Elon Musk is saying, this idea about freedom of information being paramount above all else, that woke was a kind of perversion of the liberal order, and therefore we need to bring things back to some kind of sacred, older, notional, golden era that may have only ever existed in our minds, or their minds. At any rate, I wanted to share that anecdote and ask that question to our panelists here and see what they think about that. And it shoehorns quite nicely with one of the questions that I was given, which is, should we dispense with civil liberties for the sake of security? It's another way of asking the question. This is a question I think that in some societies, they don't really get to ask that question, but in our, and again, quote unquote, Western liberal order, we ponder these questions all the time. And I think we're being forced to ponder them again, anew. Maybe Susan, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I guess I don't have much of a choice. Although I suspect that I was invited to be on this panel as a token socialist, and don't expect, but that's okay. I can play that role. I do not.
I don't regard you as a token anything.
Okay.
And
No, you see, I don't think that woke. Not only do I think woke is not left, I think woke was a way of propping up a liberal order. And I do distinguish between being liberal and leftist, okay? It's far easier to diversify your board or your employees than it is to actually give them decent working conditions, okay? Much less deal with the basic structure. So my answer is, no, we need a much deeper transformation. And even the way that that question is posed presupposes a very small number of alternatives. Namely, since we've been told since '91 that every possible form of socialism leads straight to the gulag, that alternative is ruled out. So either we have the admittedly ailing liberal democracies, or we have a sort of Chinese solution which manages to combine the worst features of communism and the worst features of capitalism in one, okay?
Right. Yeah. You reminded me of Bush. One of the things George W. Bush used to say a lot in the early 2000s when we were at war with a number of countries following 9/11 was, they hate our freedoms. And I remember I was always frustrated by that phraseology because, of course, jihadism implied a lot more than that. But it was, I guess, a useful catchphrase. And so often, I guess, our politics are dumbed down into useful catchphrases that, of course, are reductionist and exclude all kinds of alternative thinking. Nataliya, please.
So I think I also have quite a role here to play of like the character who lives, in the war zone. But that means that you also have a very clear view how to survive. You kind of know what are your best chances. Therefore, I claim that it's a wrong choice whether we choose between civil liberties or security, because the liberties are actually the only way to security, at least for me. So I give you an example. I was brought here, invited by the Colombian journalist Catalina Gómez, who lives permanently in Tehran, but for the last 3 years is mainly in Kiev, in Ukraine. She reports Ukraine. And she always says that she feels more secure in Kiev. That's where she can breathe, be kind of okay. However, we have air alerts, we have bombs falling, but I also understand that there is a chance, there is a danger. But this suffocating idea of that you don't belong to yourself, you can be abducted, you can be detained, it's very realistic. So for me, also remembering, we fought for our democracy in 2014. And I do remember the last day of kind of authoritarian purge of our former president, when I really understand, would we journalists be kidnapped? And I felt less safe there, less secured than today under the Russian bombs. And this is also the case for a lot of people in the Russian occupation.
quick follow-up question, Nataliya. I mean, Nataliya makes the point, she lives in Kyiv, capital city of Ukraine, which, as you all know, is under military assault. And there are these, unlike cities like even Cartagena, there are occasional killer drones that get through, people get killed in a building, etc. I was just reminded that, of course, since you are living in a war zone, despite the fact that Ukraine is a democracy, its normal political transition has been suspended in time, right? Because of the war. And have civil liberties been suspended in any way? I just want to hear you tell us what those are, and if they are bothersome to you as a citizen, or you make the profound difference with those that are being, that are there in the country that's attacking you, Russia.
That's actually very interesting, because indeed we have some things which are suspended for sake of security, like, providing some data, but also we have now temporary not having elections, which is also a very interesting thing. However, we do practice democracy because we do have the parliament, the most important, the political discussion. And it's strange to say that, it's for me so normal that, the biggest scandal today is the fight between the independent board of the Ministry of Defense for some procurement and the Ministry of Defense. So all media about that, the country is kind of divided around that. Some procurement in military ministry, where the Minister of Defense needs to defend himself from the civil society leaders, part of the government, and which is an example of quite an interesting process that, during the fighting war, you have this level of discussion, debates in that. So no, that's the point. We didn't have our civil liberties not being practiced during the war, which is also tells that democracy is not just elections. It couldn't be narrowed down to that. It's something more.
So is it democracy on hold?
No, it's not democracy. It's democracy with some of the restrictions, because we define it as living according to the laws.
Living what?
According to the laws.
Okay.
According to the rule of law.
Rule of law. Okay, thank you. I mean, I think it's interesting for Colombians. This is a country that went through decades of civil war and paramilitary terror, guerrilla violence. It's still going on in parts of the country, and there have been different approaches to its civil rights and its approach to civic freedoms during during various governments. I remember there was a period of time in which one of the presidents here created a system called Seguridad Ciudadana, citizens' security, for which, again, certain freedoms were, how should we put it, curtailed or put on hold in favor. It's a different point. Edward, would you like to have a stab at this?
Sure. Well, I don't think one should, in principle, give up one's liberties to, protect one's securities. And one of the things that worries me about at least the Western societies is that we've become more and more risk averse. And as we become more and more risk averse, we're prepared to give up our liberties in order to avoid the risks that we perceive. And I felt this personally very strongly during the pandemic, which came, when it came to Europe and spread across Europe, there was suddenly a very strong demand for the government to do something about it. And before you'd blinked, we were locked up in our houses, not allowed to go out, not allowed to attend the funerals of friends and relatives who died. And that lasted on and off for a long time. It was associated then with quite a degree of government propaganda. In Britain, the government spent a huge amount of money plastering posters, sort of propaganda posters, to get people to fear the pandemic, and then followed by vaccines and vaccine mandates. And all of this with very high levels of popular supports, according to the polls, so that the politicians apparently didn't feel they had any choice but to go with it. And living in the country, not far from you, I was just sitting on my hill wondering, you know, had they thought through what they were doing? Was it these suspensions of the right of associations, some inhibitions on and restrictions on freedom to question what was going on? I found, you know, deeply shocking. It wasn't, you know, like being in Nazi Germany, but it was a sudden shift from the type of society I thought I'd been brought up in, and that, I think, you know, particularly confirmed me that experience. And I don't know how it was here, that one should protect one's liberties, even when people are telling you that there are risks that require your liberties to be taken away.
You've narrated the kind of impositions on civil liberty as was seen in Britain during the pandemic in a very sort of gentle, reasonable way, which is completely understandable. But there are people and there are political movements that have arisen out of that same period and out of that same mindset, out of the same similar reactions, but taken to a more extreme level, that have now fed into some of these, in fact, into many of the new right-wing populisms we're seeing in the world. Yes, I was recently in Milei's Argentina, where that sort of anti-vaxxer thing, this idea of the past left-wing government's imposition of a very strict restrictions on their civil liberties, nourished the wellspring for the Milei phenomenon.
Yeah, and I had friends who were sort of had similar views to me, but took them a bit further than I did, and they then fall into the sort of conspiracy theory. I was, a cock-up theorist, which apparently is a lower form of conspiracy theorist, and conspiracy theorists. I think what happens. I think it's the way I think of it is it's a bit like the Reformation. You have Catholic Church ruling Europe. The moment you destroy the monopoly of the Catholic Church, then 1,000 different sects grow up, religious sects grow up. Some of them, like the Anabaptists, completely crazy. Some of them less crazy. And I think what happens is that, and again, I think what happens is when governments do things that undermine people's trust, and trust is broken, then suddenly, instead of people following a single narrative, they then follow a vast number of different narratives. And it takes, once you go down that route, it takes a certain amount of self-discipline not to then fall for the more extreme narratives, you see.
Thanks. Anne, I mean, many of these talking points sort of, merge into one another. And so, you've written extensively and observed extensively the rise of autocracy. You've studied the way communism worked in the past. You've recently written about and you've compared various of the contemporaneous autocracies we see around the world today. Are any of them, in your point of view, and I'm asking for the sake of asking, do any of these illiberal democracies represent a viable alternative to the notional democracy that maybe some of us grew up with?
So let me begin by saying that throughout history, you can find times when people are willing to give up their rights because they're frightened. Whether it's during a war, whether it's during a pandemic, whether it's because of fear of crime. You can find, whether it's Napoleon or whether it's World War I in the United States. I mean, there is a series of, there are many, or whether it's the recent pandemic, you can find a lot of examples. The question is always then, for how long do you give them up? Because the longer you do, the more easy it is to abuse them. Once you've given up, some absolute rights, once you've given up the rule of law, once you've given up independent courts, it's very, very difficult ever to get them back because the system is corrupted. The second part of your question is, it's paradoxical. I mean, in fact, there isn't really any such thing as illiberal democracy. There are illiberal states and there are illiberal leaders. And in fact, the primary way in which modern democracies decline now, and this has been true for some decades, is through an elected leader, sometimes very popularly elected, who then assaults the political system, often beginning with describing himself or his party as the only real leadership, we're the real Americans, or we're the real Poles, or we're the real Venezuelans, as opposed to the foreigners and the elites of the other party. So ceasing to see all citizens as the same, or as having equal rights, or an equal voice. Then once elected, there are different patterns, although they often amount to the same thing: assaulting the independence of the courts, assaulting the independence of the media, removing people's rights, seeking to change the Constitution. There's a pattern. It can be left-wing, it can be right-wing, it can be Hugo Chavez, it can be Viktor Orban, maybe it will be Donald Trump. But they
maybe
it's starting.
Isn't it Donald Trump?
Probably, yes. But they amount to the same thing. And what they are is a degradation of democracy. Illiberal democracy is an oxymoron. I mean, it doesn't, either you have a democracy that's based on the rule of law and on a set of agreed rights and on a constitution, written or unwritten, that the courts, and the judges respond to, or it's a decayed form of that. So there isn't really some kind of other democracy out there that we can turn to that's somehow better. And what you have is a series of illiberal states that most of which eventually decline into dictatorship.
Yeah, absolutely. But the problem we have, it's beyond semantics or correct definition. It's that you have people in power today who are defining themselves as upholders of a democratic system, but in our way. Nayib Bukele is doing it in El Salvador by locking up 2 or 3% of the population and dispensing with civil liberties, and he's receiving whatever it is, 87, 97% of the...
This is not new. So Hitler described himself as a Democrat. Mussolini described himself as a Democrat. Putin and Xi describe themselves as Democrats.
Exactly.
The word Democrat gets used by a lot of people who don't believe in a rights-based, law-based political system.
And I agree with you. The issue I think that we're facing today is that, lo and behold, we're in a region here, 25 countries approximately, many of which have come into democratic transitions in the past 40 years, most of which have also seen the term democracy tarnished because all they've seen is electoral change. And they've seen, in many cases, it's often come with the liberal economic order that got rid of big state and came with privatizations. They've seen a whole slew of very profoundly corrupt democracies change places in their societies. So
corrupt democracy? There's one advantage to having a corrupt democracy as opposed to having a corrupt dictatorship, which is that you can change it. That's the only advantage.
Yes. Until the point that it becomes a dictatorship, but still calls itself a democracy.
But you can't change it.
Well, yeah. In theory, you can, because you can go and vote.
No, not it. Well, if it's a dictatorship, voting doesn't work.
There's different types of corruption.
The point of illiberal democracies or hybrid systems or eventually autocracies is that they rig the system. And what's the point of assaulting all these institutions? The point is to rig the system so that one party always wins, or has such a huge electoral advantage that no other party can win. We just had a democratic election in Venezuela, and the opposition won.
Yes, as far as we
nevertheless, the system is rigged so that power did not change hands. So that's a dictatorship.
So you would dispute the question that was posed to me to ask, which was that, are we living through the end of an era of Western-only narratives of democracy? You would dispute the idea that there are different forms of democracy. Malaysian, Venezuela, Argentine, let's not go to Venezuela, Icelandic, South African.
That's absurd. Of course, there are many different forms of democracy. I don't have any.
I think there's this idea that the West knew best, and now maybe it does no longer. If what we've done in the West is elect Donald Trump president, aren't we seeing him do exactly
Did people in Colombia always think that the West was the best? Was there an era when that was true? I would be surprised.
But I'm not talking about. I'm using the pluralistic we here.
No, look, there have always been many different kinds of democracies. There are parliamentary democracies and presidential democracies, and people have had different rules. And I don't think there's ever been actually, the United American style democracy is very unusual. And peculiar, and very few countries have. Nobody has an electoral college like the United States. It's a very odd form of democracy. Also I worry that you and your questioner at the previous event are also mixing categories. Clearly we are at the end of something, and what we are at the end of is 80 years of. It's not just, American hegemony is really the wrong word, because it was 80 years of a UN-based or international law-based idea of international politics. One in which the language of human rights was written into the founding documents of every single international institution.
That's rights.
Over. Yeah.
Let's remember some human rights, that is political rights. But
whatever it is now, that is over, and we now have a series of powers who are seeking to overthrow that and remove that language, and they may be succeeding.
Correct. I wouldn't dispute that, but I really want to bring to the fore the fact that the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was ratified by all of the countries, almost all of the countries that were around in 1948, included social as well as political rights. That is, things that liberal democracies call benefits or privileges. And that might be, the absence of social rights might be the fatal flaw in liberal democracies, is an idea that I think we really need to begin taking seriously.
You mentioned the UN, I think, Anne. What we're seeing also seems to be a kind of collapse, maybe in slow motion, of the multilateral system that sustained, however we want to define the order that we've had since the end of World War II, in front of us. Just over this last few days, a rebel group swept into Goma, a city in eastern Congo, and has taken over an area very rich in mineral resources. And it's sort of the latest ruction or visible point in a war that's been going on ever since the Rwanda genocide in 1994. And it's a battle over resources. But where is the UN? Where are the UN peacekeepers? Where are the UN peacekeepers in any of these conflicts?
Where's the UN in Ukraine?
Exactly. Where's the UN?
Or in Gaza.
Or Gaza.
Or Gaza, exactly. Nataliya, you'd like to say something?
Yeah, because I think that it's because, in a country which is literally fighting for democracy, I think, and also coming from the country where we have a lot of conversation with Europeans. We're European, by the way. For a while we were declined to be considered that our values are Europeans. They were, however they were. I believe in them to be called like more universal. I don't think they are very much different. But I think my problem with democracy is that it's rather non-practiced and became very theoretical for some parts of the world, and you really can compare that when you really fight for that, when it's always life and death situation, whether you can have the president you've chosen yourself, whether you have the right to decide what educational system you can have, whether, you can understand how you want to live, and that's exactly what Ukraine is fighting for. But in the discussion with a lot of European counterparts, I hear that it's very theoretical. It's really about the term. So I would rather say that democracy and the discourse actually of the dictators is not often that we are democratic. They say democracies are weak and there is a different system of governance which is more efficient, which is more stable. But I think that democracy isn't weak. It's weak when it's not practiced. Because I think the problem is that it's kind of like the muscles of the astronaut. If you just think about that and do not practice, it's atrophied. It's just not working, because what I observe in a lot of societies, it's not really practiced between the elections. It's very much narrowed down as a choice which made the dictators, authoritarian leaders to misuse the elections as such. But if you really do things, if you really, practice it, if you, follow that, and I'm speaking about the return to the political life, when you really participate in the life of your community, in the life of your city, but not just think that you're paying the taxes and some people somewhere will decide that. And that's what I see the problem. And however I see the globally, and the people try to practice that. So I think we shouldn't really despise the term. We just really need to make it real and practical.
I agree, and I agree that the term can become a bit of a bundle. But Edward, let me go back to you. Why do you think autocracy as a tendency of politics is coming into the fore, even in what used to be called the democratic West, or maybe it still is?
Well, I'm not sure if I do think that.
When you look across the pond to the United States,
well,
are you not slightly disturbed?
Yeah, I'm sort of disturbed before and after the event. I was disturbed by what I felt was some inhibitions on the practice of a free society under the previous administration, and one has certain foreboding of what comes next. However, and this is perhaps why I differ from other people, is I have this feeling that people conceive of the success of a democracy being the election of people whose ideas they approve of. And therefore it's a market, democracy works if it gives the right answer. And I don't think that's a fair way of looking at the system. The way I would look at it, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, is yes, of course, the aim of democracy is you get to kick the bastards out when they've done a bad job. And I think one has to accept what the result is, even if it isn't the result that you would personally choose. I mean, most of my life, I have not when I've gone to election, voted in election, the result has not been for the party or the person I voted for. I just shrug my shoulders and go about my business. I think what is worrying is the lack of, the undermining of acceptance and consent to democratic outcomes. And obviously, we saw that after Trump lost the first re-election campaign, which was deplorable. But we also saw it in the UK after the referendum to leave the European Union. which was the largest.
People assaulted the Westminster after
No,
the referendum?
but there was a long and consistent attempt not to implement the referendum, and that showed, to my mind, a lack of consent to the democratic vote, and I find that very worrying. And to me, I see the same vice on both sides of the political divide.
Do you think that it's a failure of agreement to democracy when it turns out that the most Googled question the day after Brexit was, "What is the EU?" I mean, for democracy to work, you have to assume.
No, I don't think so. Look,
no, you don't have to assume that people know what they're voting for?
I don't. No, I don't. I think that one should respect individuals. One should respect
individuals who vote on, a generational change without having the first idea of what it is?
How do you know that they didn't have the first idea?
Oh, there's a lot of information about that. I mean,
this is something that wasn't in the talking points, but which nonetheless.
Let's have a big fight about Brexit.
Yeah. Let's fight. I've been traveling over the past week or so. It's only been 2 weeks since, and again, forgive me for even mentioning his name, but Donald Trump has been in the White House for the second time. And I think one of the things I'm not shocked by much, but I've been taken aback by the degree to which the spirit of his government is retributive, is malign in its intent to unwind and undo a system that rhetorically, at least to him and his team, was profoundly wrong, was unfair, was woke. You can see where I'm going with this, Susan. I was aware that conservatives, and plenty of people I know as well, every time you had a dinner party, if you're over 50, at the end of the evening, everybody sort of lets off steam about wokeness, and has done for the last several years. They mostly weren't doing it in public, but they were doing it as grumpy old men and women in private, right? Because very often their kids were...
Young ones too, by the way.
Yeah, but not so much. But I was unaware of the degree to which this would be a plank of government. That in fact, an anti-woke agenda truly is fueling this retributive, castigatory effort to weed out people who are somehow inside the system. It's almost like a de-Stalinization a program that's underway, where not just political appointees, but career bureaucrats are being winnowed out, fired, told to leave the system. And of course, we're seeing a kind of shock and awe approach to government, where entire funding systems are being shut down, and a new order imposed.
Illegally shut down.
Yes, illegally. But then we have a rapist, a convicted rapist and sex abuser, who has gone to the White House, don't we?
Felon on all kinds of counts.
So maybe you can help us here, Susan, since you've written this book, The Left is Not Woke. Please, to what degree was this, how do you explain this phenomenon of wokeness that seems to have so instigated a backlash and very often been the incendiary fuel for the rise of the right-wing populisms? I saw it in Brazil with Bolsonaro. Here, I remember the no vote against the peace deal, the initial peace deal, was fueled by this idea that the president at the time, with the FARC guerrillas, had made some sort of deal to legalize homosexual teaching in schools. There was a rally the day before the vote, and the initial vote lost. And according to a lot of analysts, it had much to do with this idea that was being propagated by conservative clerics and a former president that this was part of the agenda. And so, in fact, they had to sort of defang the peace deal, which was then passed in a slightly more conservative fashion a couple of months later. The day after that peace deal, I was here, I was in Medellin, someone came up to me and said, it was the no vote. So they said no to the first peace deal. Someone came up to me and said, you know what this means, John Lee? I said, no, what does it mean? They said, it means Trump's going to win. It was the American campaign, and at the time I couldn't fathom that man would win an election. But they were right. And since then, again, like I said, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Milei in Argentina recently, etc., we've seen this idea of anti-wokeism, this idea of gender ideology being used to fuel this kind of right-wing sweep.
So look, among the many things Donald Trump doesn't know what he's talking about, he doesn't know what he's talking about when he says the Marxist woke left. I mean, those are three terms that don't belong together, okay? But he knows correctly, like Bolsonaro, like people who objected to Boric's attempt to revise the Chilean constitution, like people in other places, this is an easy way to get a rise out of people by confusing what a genuine left liberal program would be with the symbolic politics that has actually led to, occasionally it's led to some incompetence. It's mostly led to a lot of silliness. I was appalled when I read a piece in the New York Times, I think 2 days ago or 3 days ago, which said, well, Meta workers are fighting back against, against Mark Zuckerberg's new turn to the
Putting
right.
tampons in the men's bathroom.
And I thought, holy shit, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
And the focus on those kinds of issues you're absolutely right. When I first presented this book about 1.5 years ago in Princeton, I said, this book arose from the conversations that all of you have been having in private. And everyone nodded and laughed because the confusion between what's woke and what's left, or liberal left, had left everyone feeling guilty about criticizing what they saw as perhaps an excess of left liberal ideas or a radicality. And my thesis is simply, no, woke is built on a confusion between ideas and emotions. And the emotions are indeed traditionally emotions that people on the liberal left have held, namely, if in doubt, you stand with the underdog. There's a nice German expression, the heart beats on the left, which is true, okay? But it's confused by the fact that an awful lot of right-wing ideologies coming straight out of people like Carl Schmitt have been taken over by the woke, which is why people have such a hard time defining it or standing up against it. And I was also warned when I was writing this book by a number of people who said, Susan, I basically agree with your arguments, but you're giving aid and credence to the right if you criticize woke. And I think, unfortunately, if more people on the left had, take Biden. Okay, Biden was very woke and not very left. Okay? And by announcing that he was going to appoint the first black woman to the Supreme Court right before the South Carolina primary, he managed to undermine, I'm sure Ketanji Brown Jackson is at least as qualified as most of the sitting justices. But as soon as you say that, you're undermining people's qualifications and making people angry on all sides of the spectrum.
I think all of some social media has a lot to answer for the access to which leaders use it.
Oh, so does the New York Times, though. I mean, the New York Times is very woke, too.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to let Nataliya say something, and then I want to ask one more question quickly before we go to questions. Thank you.
So I want a bit to cheer people up. It's usually also my role as a Ukrainian, always be the most optimistic person in the room, because the hope for future is the only thing we have. But I give you a bit like, I'll tell a short story about this continent, because I don't want us to be here like saying how gloomy things are, because we so often speak about what we can lose, how bad things could be, and I do think being at that edge as we are, we really need to speak how much we have still, how much we could exercise things, and how much we still can, do what we can do, which is a bit more empowering than just kind of having these apocalyptical ideas about the future. So I had a chance to be last year a lot in Latin America with a particular reason. I won't go into depths. I'm working in the war crimes documentation, and we filed a criminal complaint to the Federal Court of Argentina on the case of the Ukrainian man who survived tortures in Russian-occupied territories, because Argentina has this universal jurisdiction and the history. So in order not to be parachuted, it has nothing to do with Milei, I started to dig a lot about, history of the junta, wars, and I've been coming, we're doing the documentary. So I was living a bit in the past of this continent. For the last year, I'm reading, researching Peru, Chile, Argentina, all the history. And I found myself on the street at the day of the remembrance and memory, at the day where the mass protest, anti-Milei protest, with the people, fighting him. And I was with the Argentinian journalist who really, because we were like in history, he was telling, here the streets I was caught up, here how it was during the dirty wars. And we saw that group of young people with the LGBT flags, but they were young Kirchneristers, and I was explained that they are pro-Putin. Okay, it's one thing, it's okay. But they were pro-Putin, and they were also, I was also explained that these people are also supporting kind of Russia, they're very anti-Ukrainian. And they were chanting like, down with dictatorship, something like that. And to be honest, I was so happy, I almost cried. I found myself very bizarre. I was crying because I was very happy for these people, because I understood that their kind of protest, they could afford to have a carnival. Because I was in the streets of Minsk and in Moscow. I know what it means to have a demonstration where people would be gassed half an hour later. You need to run very fast because you'll be beaten. And I knew it won't happen. Those people were totally, not myself. I thought that if they knew a Ukrainian, and maybe they would have an unpleasant conversation. But I was so happy for them that they can afford this carnival kind of type of the protest. And I was thinking no back, because my mind was still in 70s, 80s, and I was like, this continent is changed. It's really democratic. They are practicing. There are problems, but it's the turning point, I don't know, but they can chance to vote out Milei in some of the years. It was not the end. So I really, coming from that perspective, from very far away, but also from this historical journey I had, I felt like, don't be so depressed. Things are actually probably way better, and that's what I want just to say.
So not quite, don't worry, be happy, but yeah, like that Jamaican song. I used to hate that song.
Work, do things, but...
Look, thanks. I think we've reached I was going to ask a series of questions about immigration, but I think it's too late for that. So there may be people here who would like to ask questions of some of our panelists. And I think there's probably some kind of liberal order to this. Imposed by the Hay Festival. Should there be? Is there a microphone? ¿Hay micrófono para los que quieren hablar? Is there? Yeah, I know, but I think, is that how you do it? Okay. Please, please identify yourself and say your name. And just say who you'd like to ask the question of, yeah. Can't really hear you. You can take mine if you like.
Firstly, thank you. What a privilege to hear so many great minds. John Lee, actually saw you speak yesterday, and you highlighted the presence of the American oligarchs standing next to Trump during his inauguration. And it made me think of Jane Jacobs, who wrote in her book Systems of Survival that the problem is not necessarily our governmental systems, but it's when they're corrupted by trade and vice versa. We're living in a world now where we have capitalism, which is perhaps out of control. It is degrading our environmental systems, and it is increasing inequalities around the world. When we say the word democracy, we automatically think about capitalism. Is there a way that in order to save democracy and therefore our civil liberties, we can decouple it from capitalism? Or is there a way that we can change capitalism so that it corrupts our democracy less?
Would you like to? Great question, thank you. I'll let Anne answer that. And, well, maybe it seems like they would all like to answer that. So let's try to be quick. Yeah.
One of the things that in my book, Autocracy, Inc., one of the themes that ties together most modern dictatorships is that they are enthusiastic participants in what I would call the alternate economy. So most of us here in this room, I'm guessing, maybe not everybody, we live in the real economy. We work at a job, we pay taxes, we keep our money in a bank, when we're regulated, we follow the regulations. In addition to that world, there is another world, which I'm sure you all are aware of, in which people don't pay taxes, in which they keep their money in offshore tax havens, they use anonymous accounts to move money around the world. They buy property anonymously, including a lot of it in central London or in Manhattan, in places that are otherwise run by the rule of law. That world, that world of kleptocratic, however you want to, capitalism, I do think is one of the sources of democratic decline in the United States, in Europe, and I'm sure in Latin America as well. And I do think that, I mean, not just regulating, but eliminating that world, which is possible. It's a world that we created with our laws. It's a world that enabled the rise of Putin in Russia. I mean, he was somebody who became to power, as his whole generation did, by stealing from the state, taking money out of the country, laundering it, and then bringing back again. But he became the model for a series of other autocrats around the world. But that model also continues to corrupt our own democracy. So I do think that pushing back or eliminating that would be an enormous boom to democracy. I don't think you can take away small business, sorry.
It occurs to me that we have, since you mentioned this whole idea of these, that essentially pirate havens for capital, Edward, is it feasible to shut these down?
But shutting down?
The movement of great capital, the idea that the Russian oligarchs purchasing essentially London and...
Yeah, I mean, you can cut off international capital flows. It's been done in the past. But to go back to the question you posed, which I think is an interesting one, and you posed it by mentioning, I think, the oligarchs, at the inauguration. And I think the problem we have today, one of the problems we have today, is that what we call capitalism has morphed into creating the most powerful and profitable companies the world has ever seen, thanks to sort of global technology. And that gives these individuals huge amounts of power. And one senses there's a sort of deal between, if you will, want to call them the tech oligarchs and the governments that keep the profits and of these and the monopolies of these companies in existence in exchange for support. And I think that can be reformed and can be broken. In fact, I think it's probably quite likely that with artificial intelligence as the next iteration of the technology revolution, that this may actually break up all these oligarchies, and in which case it would be a jolly good thing. But as to the other point, can you separate what you might call capitalism from democracy or economic freedoms? I tend to believe not. I think that our economic freedoms are the underpinning of our political freedoms, and if you take your economic freedoms away, the next step is to take the political freedoms. So I adhere to the sort of Hayekian road to serfdom idea, and I think that I agree very strongly that you need to control the monopolies and break up the monopolies, but the underpinning of economic freedom is the basis upon which our political freedoms are held.
Thanks, Edward. Susan, if you can be brief, because I'd like to try to take one more if we can. Thank you.
I'll try to be brief, but I would answer the question, which was a good one, in, let's say, a less reformist view than the two previous speakers. That is, as soon as we allow that capitalism has different forms and that it has morphed into all kinds of terrifying features, then we need to ask ourselves, well, can't there be different forms of socialism, or do they all lead straight to the gulag? Can there be a form of democracy which is social democracy? And as Anne said early on, if a democracy is the rule of law plus the agreement to respect certain rights, then I want to go back to the idea that social rights are genuine rights, and they're not actually taken seriously in most countries of the world. If we took them seriously, we would be doing the planet a favor, as well as dealing with the horrendous inequality gap.
Thank you, Susan. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Is there someone?
Make it
an easy question, not a speech, and we'll try to answer it in sort of speed dating style.
Okay, over here. Yep.
Hi there.
This is a question for Susan. In your book, you speak about difference between being liberal and being left, and you say how nowadays, especially in America, Democrats are being the conservative ones, and actually Trump represents the breaking down of establishment. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Wait, do I say that? I mean, no, it's certainly. He does, okay. Look, what Trump represents, most importantly, I think, is the fruition of a series of ideologies that we have not taken into question. And the one that I think is actually most dangerous, because nobody considers it an ideology, is evolutionary psychology, which claims to be science, okay? We all know, apart from the fact that evolutionary psychology has been criticized by very well-known scientists, that we sometimes act in ways that go against our immediate self-interest, that all of our struggles are not struggles for power. And Trump, and that we don't go around the world trying to make as many iterations of ourselves as possible. Trump is that, okay? Trump is the end point of an absolute set of amoral assumptions that we have, both people on both left and right, have been taken for granted for at least the past 30 years. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
I think.
Oh yeah, the difference between being liberal and being left. So very quickly, liberals and leftists, number one, are universalists rather than tribalists. Number two, believe that it's in principle possible to distinguish between power and justice, even if they get confused sometimes. Number three, they believe that it's possible to make progress. We're also free to regress. Now, I think those are principles, I don't know, I haven't talked to Anne privately, that both of us would agree on as liberal principles that unfortunately the woke have abandoned. The difference between liberals and leftists is simply that leftists believe that social rights are genuine rights and as important as political rights. But I'm happy to be in a big tent with anybody who will agree with the first three principles.
Can I just add one thing? I'll very briefly. You are correct to see Trump as something different. I think it's a great mistake, in fact, to describe the current American administration as conservative. I don't think that's the right word for it.
Agreed.
And even right-wing is not quite right. I mean, if you look at who's in the cabinet, these are some of them are very radical people who are outside the definition of right and left. Yeah. And some of them are former Democrats, some of them are conspiracy theorists. You know, these are not people who are part of that traditional spectrum.
Despotic comes to mind. Deranged comes to mind.
I just read an article describing them as new Rasputins. I mean, I don't have a good term for it yet.
And let's end on a happy note from Nataliya.
I really just want to say that don't be so frightened. I think at the day when Trump won, I covered the election. So I think all the American reporters were like, we have this phrase, spitting the ashes over the hand. And I felt that they were so paranoid and so frightened that they needed to fight somebody in the position who is worse. You know, like that, like, is it worse for you? And I was like, yeah, it's not good, but you know, we'll survive. And if we'll survive, and our chances are not very good, believe you'll also. And that's something I want to tell everybody. We will, if we do something. If we just become apathetic and apocalyptical, nothing will happen. But that's what they fight against. Like made us scared. I don't know what terms you use it. Like make us scarce, paralyzed. But so just do wherever, whatever views you have, whatever policies you have, we'll find the way.
We will survive. Cue Gloria Gaynor. Yeah. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Nataliya, Susan, Edward. Thank you very much.